Today we are once again veering off for another tangent, this being our 8th now I believe, and there was some big debate about whether I was going to do this because the book we're looking at today is Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I wasn't planning to do a tangent on this at all, and I have another YouTube channel, for I'm twice the internet failure that I used to be now with my second channel, where I just do generic book reviews just so I can remember what's in them. And I was planning to do C.S. Lewis on that, but there is no religious undertone to that, so it doesn't sort of fit, and it seems it belongs more here. But all the tangents I've done so far have been pretty negative to Christianity in terms of dealing with objections, that sort of thing. But I figured, okay, well, fine, we're a year and a half into this thing-ish. So, yeah, fine, okay, let's have our first go at a tangent that is pro-Christianity. It's probably fair to say that there's nothing in this book that's going to convince someone that Christianity is true. But the thing I thought was interesting was that despite the fact this book was written in 1952, it still does a really good job of outlining the broad strokes of a case where you're kind of left with, you can't really ignore it and argue with the fact that he at least makes it sound compelling that this question is worth taking very seriously. I was probably about halfway through the book before I decided I was going to do a tangent on it. Partly because it starts in sort of fairly generic terms, and it's Clive. Who knew that C.S. Lewis stood for Clive? I don't know why. So in my head, C.S. meant that his name was, he was just such a grand character and so famous that a first name couldn't do him justice. And then you find out his name's Clive. And somehow that just delighted me. Anyway, so Clive argues that we can determine that someone created the universe by virtue of the fact it's here, which I know is, we're hence not going to do a tangent about it because everyone has, this is not new. But he also makes the case that we can deduce that this person, or this being that created the universe, is particularly interested in morality. I mean, that also isn't exactly news, as there's the moral argument for Christianity, which doesn't really sit with me very well, just because it's like, well, morality could be relative, and we all feel like it's not, but it could be. But he does at least tackle the question of different cultures and different times, which I think is where one of the relative arguments comes in and say, well, hang on, just because we think this or that is good or bad, people didn't used to think it was good or bad. And like slavery, for example, that was commonplace everywhere, and it was sort of kind of normalised, wasn't it? But C.S. Lewis sort of argues that if people really stopped and thought about it, and really dug deep, they could work out that it wasn't right, that perhaps it just momentum, just go with the crowd, and it sort of sits, and it did eventually evaporate, reflecting that. But so nothing particularly new there anyway, but still a good solid outlining of those two arguments and linking them together I thought was interesting as well. I think the point at which I actually decided that, okay, yes, I am going to do a tangent on this, is when he concedes by acknowledging that there's an immense amount of comfort in, well, obviously he describes it as unspeakable comfort in believing that Christianity is true. This ties up with one of my hurdles that I can't quite get past. And I've talked about it dozens of times before, that the idea that we're just a little bit neurotic and we can't cope with the idea that life is hollow and meaningful and fleeting and cruel. So we look for some meaning in it. And C.S. Lewis is obviously acknowledging that, yes, there is a huge amount of comfort in the belief that there is more to it than that. And I don't know, that felt kind of like an olive branch, biblical reference aside, to sort of the left brain tortured soul like mine in terms of trying to get to grips with something that would be nice if it were true. Doesn't change anything in that, obviously, but it just seemed like an open-minded gesture from that side. Just a little bit of appreciation for the mindset that I personally am stuck with, albeit there are some other complicated bits to argue as well. Whilst obviously I don't believe the same thing as Clive believed, I would love to have seen him around to tangle with the likes of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. I always get those the wrong way around. He had a brilliant answer nearly 100 years ago for arguing against their cases they put up against religion. And that basically it's like people offering up a 6-year-old version of the argument and then dismantling that and then objecting if you give a more sophisticated answer because you're getting complicated. And it was just a particularly nice summing up that fit very nicely against all the objections that I've seen and read that were brought by Hitchens and Dawkins. He has this interesting idea that God is the fuel on which our souls run, and that Satan's objective is to trick us into thinking we can run on something else. I really like that idea. I think that's you can see how that could be true if it were true that God and Satan exist. I've got to do a tangent on Satan at some point because I have some real objections to this idea that there's an actual person doing things like that. But clearly that is a belief. But of course there's nothing in that summing up of an idea that sort of does resonate and could sound like it would make sense. Just because it sounds like it could make sense doesn't make it true. So, yeah. He also has a great 15-word answer for the problem of evil, talking about if someone is free to be good, then they are also free to be bad. I think this causes a lot of problem for a lot of people. And from my thinking was the book of Genesis sort of took care of that. And then C.S. Lewis wraps it up in 15 words. So, well done there. Good book. I mean, he's clearly good at this stuff, even if I don't agree with him. He also has this interesting take on the idea that Jesus was a good moral teacher and that was it. Because I think that's quite a common thought. There's no question that Jesus existed. You'd have to go right to the fringes of weirdness to find people who were willing to go and say that he didn't, Christopher Hitchens aside. And a lot of atheists I've spoken to, you say, okay, who was Jesus? And he was just some cool dude back then who was a great moral teacher. But C.S. Lewis makes the point that if someone had gone around saying the things Jesus was saying and was just a moral leader, he wouldn't be a good man. He'd be an utter lunatic. And it's that's a good point. And I suppose that should have been obvious, but I hadn't really thought of that. He has another interesting idea, which is, well, it's a bit too abstract for me, I think, but Christians are Christ's body through which he works. That's a hard one. I thought that's worth recording because that's an interesting take on how this is supposed to work. And that's relevant to what we're trying to work out here. But yeah, that's heavy. One of my favourite things in the book actually was he talks about people need to be reminded more often than they need to be instructed, which I think is why it's really obvious the basic things that you kind of know can feel like these massive revelations when you hear them back in well thought out form. And I get that a lot. You read things and just think, yeah, that's brilliant, and it's great. You know, I kind of knew that, but it was in the fog around the periphery of your memory, and it helps it bring it into the centre and you can focus on it, that sort of thing. And that is just part of human nature. That's completely unrelated to whether the Bible's true and all the rest of it, just sharing an interesting point. Another great concept he illustrates well is he talks about when a man is getting better, he understands more and more the evil inside him. Obviously it has to be a man because he was writing in 1952, but you know, timeline aside, all of us, as we become better people, become more aware of our dark bits, I suppose. And I quite like that. I think that does seem reasonably true. Again, doesn't necessarily tie to proof that there's a moral compass and all the rest of it. An objective moral compass, that is. But I really like that idea that the better we get, the more aware we get of the bad bits in us, which we all obviously have. I think I probably take quite a bit of comfort in that, actually, because as I'm getting older, I like to think I'm becoming a better person as I age. And I am getting more and more aware of the things I need to stay away from because they're not good for me and they don't help me to be my best self, as it were. So, yeah, I quite like that C.S. Lewis gives that sort of idea his blessing. Yet another interesting idea, I could do this as bullet points, couldn't we? He talks about this idea that if we only live for 80, 90, 100 years, then incremental differences in how we progress, whether we get slightly better with age or slightly worse with age, because people go both directions, don't they, doesn't make a massive difference over the span of 100 years or whatever. But if we are infinite souls, then tiny incremental differences over massive scales of time will make just this enormous difference to what the person we start with is, and what the person not end because it's infinite, but and where we get to. And I really like that. That's, I work in finance. That's like compound interest. Do compound interest over a short period, it's really boring. Do it over 40 years, it's basically magic. And tied in with that, you do also see, you get people who you can see are they're not getting better. They may not be getting worse. Maybe some of them maybe are getting worse. I'm 45, should I not be better than I was at 25? And the idea that it's within us to be pushing that in the right direction. I really like that anyway, but responsibility is one of my favourite principles in the world, so I guess that ties in nicely to that. Again, obviously, I don't think that helps in terms of it's not going to prove anything is true or anything, and doesn't help to contribute to the idea of whether Christianity might be right or not. But the idea that if it is right, oh my goodness, it starts to matter more and more that we're heading in the right direction, because the timescale is just much longer than it would otherwise be. A timely, interesting point in this is that on my other YouTube channel, the last book I reviewed was Tony Blair's new one on leadership. And completely unrelated to leadership, he talks about the idea of pride. And I sort of found that interesting because there's this idea that pride is one of the 7 deadly sins, but there's nothing wrong with pride in some contexts. And Tony Blair made the distinction that there are 2 types of pride, because in French they actually have 2 different words for the 2 different types. I suppose arguably we have pride and hubris, but it tends to be that people just talk in terms of pride being an umbrella. C.S. Lewis talks about pride being the worst character flaw and the ultimate anti-God state of mind. The idea of this competitive pleasure and being higher than others. And it's, I guess that is at the hubris end. But yeah, he talks about it being like spiritual cancer, basically. He does, to be fair, make the same distinction Tony Blair made, in that there is a difference between the warm-hearted admiration sort of thing versus the idea that we're just so super clever and special that we're just better than other people and more important and all the rest of it. And yeah, I mean, that again is another thing that makes sense in a world regardless of whether Christianity is true or not. But then it's also interesting that he ties that to being the ultimate anti-God state of mind. So yeah, I guess there's an argument that some sort of pride is taking place. Or if God exists, then to deny that is surely sort of a hubris, isn't it? It's to hold oneself above the idea of God, maybe. Don't know. Big ideas, these, anyway, aren't they? Yet another one, he talks about, because there's this bit we've encountered previously, is love your neighbour as yourself. And my feeling was that that's a double imperative, so you have to love your neighbour and you have to love yourself, and that's what I sort of dwelt on. But there's love your neighbour, I mean, what does that sort of really mean? And that's not very convenient either, is it? But C.S. Lewis does a really nice job of clarifying that for us. It just talks about, it just means wishing them well, not wishing the worst upon them. You don't have to like them, which is a great source of relief. Although, to be fair, it's still pretty difficult to wish some people well, isn't it? That's a proper dig deep kind of thing. But then I suppose that ties back to the idea of being a better person and practicing that as we try and grow and become better. Another idea that links back to another book I did on the other channel. I read Jordan Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God, which has nothing to do with God, hence it's on that channel, not this one. And he talks about this idea that spoiling children is just, it's a terrible thing to do to them. C.S. Lewis absolutely agrees, and it's just basically gratifying our own affectionate impulses at the expense of the child's real happiness later on. Again, nothing to do with Christianity there, I suppose. I'm starting to wonder, as I'm recording this, should this be a tangent? But I still think it needs recording and it can't go on the other one, so we're going to do it as a tangent. The idea also that belief must be fed. And I heard someone else say this a while ago, and instinctively, initially, I was a little bit suspicious of it, because it's a bit like, well, if it's not true, and you have to just sort of keep brainwashing yourself and keep the brainwash level topped up, otherwise you're not actually going to maintain that, and you'll see the light for what it really is. And I really like that Clive is open about that, because saying belief must be fed is sort of opening oneself up to that objection, I think. But you wrestle with it and try and is this, can this be right? Can this make sense? And I think sort of. When I was a teenager, I was a Christian, and I did believe this stuff, and it sort of fell away. I was talking to my daughter about this because she was asking what happened, and it was nothing significant. I moved house at 16, so I was sort of quite well tied up with the church where we used to live, and then when I moved to the new one, I wasn't, and suddenly, next thing I know, I'm driving a car and I can go everywhere, and it's all very exciting. So it's not like I had a sudden, I don't believe this stuff anymore. It was complete bunch of rubbish. It was, to some extent, it was the questions became more sophisticated and the level of church I was engaging with just wasn't answering those. But also, probably to some extent, I just stopped feeding that belief, perhaps. So, yeah, it's an interesting idea, and not a massively comfortable one, but it does suddenly make church make a lot of sense. So even if you're just going through the motions, at least you're still engaging with it. You're sort of keeping that, whether it's brainwash or reality topped up. But if it were true, it still makes sense, I think, that by not feeding that belief, you could find it dwindles. I think that's perhaps the most interesting idea in this, that I think needs, or at least argues for why it should be a tangent. He also makes the point, which it's sort of obvious, isn't it, that you get people making the objection that there are some terrible Christians and Christians who've done terrible things. And I've said throughout this whole project is blame the punk, not the religion. Clive just says, there are bad Christians because not everyone is fully Christian. Talking about, there's a sort of a continuum of Christianity and people who say, okay, maybe this is true. And, hobbyist Christians or something. And yeah, I guess that makes perfect sense that they can believe it's true, but they don't necessarily live it. And then to live it would be to go up a level and be a better Christian and a better person to some extent. But yeah, I remain not 100% sure this should be a tangent, but I figure no one's watching this anyway, and it's my stupid channel, so I'm going to do it. But I do really like that we've now got a stalwart Christian who's given us a nice outline of what he thinks Christianity should be. Because given we are trying to investigate it, it doesn't make a great deal of sense for me to sort of try and decide what I think it is and then sort of test against that. So the mighty C.S. Lewis giving us his view on what Christianity should be gives us a sort of a benchmark to go for, I think. Well worth reading anyway. It's very good. I'm struggling not to give it an A+ because I can't think of anything wrong with it. I'm not going to say there's anything wrong with it just because I don't agree with him. Yeah, fine. Yeah, read it. It's quite short too. It's a nice, easy, pretty easy going. A useful pro-Christianity thing that doesn't convince, but does at least show us the outline of what we're looking at and trying to assess.